And we should be saving this money so we can pay our fucking bill, dude, and not spend it on stupid, frivolous shit. That's what we did it for. That's what we did it for, is to pay bills, and you just want it for selfish fucking means? Do you even care about this fucking family?
Imagine you're scrolling through YouTube, maybe looking for some wholesome Christian content. You know, the kind that makes you feel like maybe there's still some good in the world. And you stumble across this channel called Shani for Christ. The thumbnail shows a smiling woman with a Bible talking about mom life and faith. Seems normal, right? It's safe, the kind of content you might even share with your grandmother. But you get a strange feeling. There's something off. You can't quite put your finger on it at first. Maybe it's the way her smile doesn't quite reach her eyes in the later videos. Maybe it's how the comment sections feel more like a battlefield than a place of worship. Or maybe it's the nagging feeling you get when someone talks about love and light. But somehow everything around them keeps getting darker. Now, what if I told you that this seemingly innocent Christian lifestyle channel would become the stage for one of the most disturbing cases of public breakdown, childhood endangerment, and religious manipulation I've ever documented? I mean, this isn't just another internet drama story. This is about how someone can weaponize faith, turn vulnerability into manipulation, and broadcast their family's destruction to the world, all while claiming to be persecuted for their beliefs. So I spent a good while looking into this case, because the more I dug into Shannon's story, yes, that's her real name, the more I realized we're not just looking at one person's mental health crisis. We're looking at how our culture consumes trauma, how platforms enable destruction, and how religion can be twisted into the perfect shield for avoiding accountability. So buckle in, because this journey is going to take us from wholesome Bible studies to CPS interventions, from six-figure inheritances to living in literal squalor, and from Christian witnesses to, well, something I'm trying to understand. Now let's talk about the perfect Christian wife. Let me paint you a picture of how this all started. So Shannon wasn't always Shannon for Christ. She was just Shannon, a woman who seemed to have found her calling in sharing her faith online. And honestly, in the beginning, there was something genuinely appealing about her content. She talked about Bible reading, prayer routines, the challenges of being a Christian wife and mother, the kind of content that fills a real need. You know, there are millions of women trying to balance faith, family, and their own identity. Shannon just seemed to just get that struggle. But here's what I find fascinating from a psychological perspective. Even in those early videos, if you watch carefully, you can see the seeds of what was coming. The way she talked about her relationship with Jason, who she called Rev, there was this underlying tension. She'd make these comments about submission and biblical marriage that sounded scripted, like she was trying to convince herself as much as her audience. And Jason? God, Jason is a whole psychological study onto himself. This man who inherited $600,000 from his parents, we'll get into that disaster later, who seemed to position Shannon as this spiritual authority while simultaneously treating her like, well, we'll see. The thing about Shannon's early content is that it worked because it felt authentic. She wasn't polished like some mega church pastor's wife. She was raw, honest about her struggles. She'd cry on camera about her faith journey, share intimate details about her marriage and parenting challenges. But you see, there's a fine line between authentic vulnerability and performing your pain for an audience. And somewhere along that way, Shannon crossed that line. The question is whether she knew she was crossing it or not. Now here's where things start getting really uncomfortable, because the transition from wholesome Christian content to what Shannon became didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, insidious, like watching someone slowly drown while they insist they're just learning to swim. The live stream started innocently enough: real-time Bible study, prayer requests, connecting with her community. But if you watch the progression, and yes, I've watched a good few, it's a lot. You see how the format itself became addictive for her. Think about it psychologically. You're broadcasting your life, getting immediate feedback, validation, sympathy. People are sending you money, telling you how much your testimony means to them. For someone who might be struggling with their sense of worth or identity, that's incredibly powerful. But then the live stream started including Jason more frequently. And this is where I had to pause and really consider what I was witnessing. Because what we're seeing is essentially the broadcasting of domestic dysfunction. Look, these weren't cute couple moments or playful banter. These were real arguments, real conflict, played out in front of hundreds of viewers. Jason would interrupt Shannon's live streams. They'd argue about money, about household responsibilities, about her health issues. And here's the part that really gets to me. The audience loved it. The more dysfunctional their relationship became on camera, the more engaged the viewers got. People would tune in specifically to watch their fights. Comments would pour in, taking sides, offering advice, sometimes just reveling in the drama. Well, there's something deeply troubling about how we as a society have learned to consume other people's pain as entertainment. And Shannon and Jason, whether they realized it or not, were feeding that hunger. Okay, so here's where we need to talk about something that makes me deeply uncomfortable, because it's crucial to understanding Shannon's psychological profile. She had developed what I can only describe as a masterclass in emotional manipulation, all wrapped in the language of Christian suffering. Let me walk you through her typical pattern, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. So first, she'd create or escalate a situation, usually related to her health, their financial situation, or conflict with Jason. Then she'd go live, visibly distressed, tears flowing, asking her prayer warriors for support. The language she used was incredibly calculated. Even if it seemed spontaneous: I don't want to be a burden, but I hate asking for help, but I know God will provide, but every statement designed to simultaneously ask for help while making the audience feel like they were the ones choosing to help, not being manipulated into it. This is textbook emotional manipulation, but with a religious twist that makes it particularly insidious. In Christian culture, you're taught to help those who are suffering, to be generous, to trust that people are telling you the truth about their needs. Shannon exploited that cultural programming ruthlessly. And the thing that really gets to me is how she'd weave in just enough real vulnerability to make it feel authentic. She would share genuine struggles, real pain, actual challenges, but then she'd amplify them, dramatize them, perform them in a way that maximized sympathy and financial support. But honestly, here's where it gets really dark. She started involving the children in these performances, Not explicitly, but she'd reference their needs, their struggles, their disappointment when daddy couldn't provide. She'd use her children's genuine suffering to manipulate strangers into sending money. Look, I had to stop watching for a few hours because I realized that what I was saying wasn't just about one woman's mental health crisis. This was about how trauma and manipulation can become a family business. Now, we need to follow the money, because this is where Shannon's story becomes absolutely insane. Remember I mentioned that Jason inherited $600,000 from his parents? Well, buckle up, because this is going to make you question everything you think you know about financial responsibility. $600,000. Let that sink in for a moment. That's more money than most people see in a lifetime. That's buy a house outright money. That's secure your children's future money. That's never have to beg strangers on the internet for grocery money. So where did it all go? Well, that's the $1,000,000 question. Literally, because somehow this couple managed to burn through more than $500,000 and end up completely dependent on internet donations for basic survival. From what I've been able to piece together from their own live streams and social media posts, the money seemed to just evaporate. There were mentions of failed business ventures, expensive medical treatments, supporting extended family members, but the math doesn't add up. What's particularly telling is how they talked about money on their live streams. Shannon would regularly claim they had nothing, that they couldn't afford food or rent, while simultaneously making references to recent purchases, trips, or expenses that suggested money was flowing through their hands regularly. And honestly, this pattern suggests something deeper than just poor financial management. This looks like someone who has a fundamentally broken relationship with money, possibly combined with addiction issues, and I don't just mean substance addiction, though we'll get to that. Okay, but here's the part that absolutely floored me. Even after burning through the inheritance, even after living in conditions that would eventually lead to CPS interventions, Shannon and Jason continued to refuse job offers. And look, Jason would literally be offered work and he'd turn it down, then go online the same day to beg for money. And this would be justified with religious language. They'd talk about waiting on God's provision, about how their ministry was more important than traditional employment, about how their online presence was their calling from God. Meanwhile, their children were living in squalor, sometimes going without basic necessities, while their parents performed their poverty for an online audience that kept sending money to enable the dysfunction. Now, we need to talk about how Shannon weaponized Christianity, because this is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of her entire psychological profile. She didn't just happen to be a Christian who struggled with mental health and made poor choices. She systematically used religious language and concepts to deflect accountability and manipulate her audience. Okay, but now let me be very clear about something. I am not criticizing Christianity or faith in general. I am talking specifically about how Shannon took genuine religious concepts and perverted them for her own psychological and financial benefit. So her go-to move was the persecution complex. Any criticism of her behavior, any questioning of her choices, any expression of concern for her children, it all got reframed as attacks on her faith. She'd literally compare herself to Jesus being persecuted, cast her critics as demons or agents of Satan. "They're attacking me because I stand for Christ," she says. "The enemy is trying to destroy our family because of our testimony. Period. We're being persecuted just like the early Christians. Period." Over and over, the same narrative framework that transformed every consequence of her actions into evidence of her righteousness. Now, what if I said this is a classic narcissistic defense mechanism, but wrapped in a religious language that makes it incredibly difficult to challenge? In Christian culture, if someone claims they're being persecuted for their faith, questioning that claim can make you look like the aggressor. No, but the most insidious part was how she used biblical concepts like forgiveness, grace, and submission to shut down legitimate concerns. People worried about the children. "Judge not lest ye be judged." People questioning the living conditions. God looks at the heart, not outward appearances. She even used prayer as a weapon. She'd pray for her haters in this condescending way that was clearly designed to make them look petty while positioning herself as the mature, forgiving Christian. And we also have Jason. Oh, Jason enabled every bit of this. He defends Shannon's spiritual authority, referred to her as a prophet, claimed that God spoke through her. It was like watching someone build a cult of personality around their spouse's dysfunction. Okay, now we get to the part of Shannon's story that's genuinely hard to watch, because what we're about to discuss isn't just dysfunction anymore, it's the complete breakdown of a family unit, broadcast in real time to an audience that had become addicted to watching the destruction. In addition, the live streams from this period they're difficult to describe. Shannon would go live in states of extreme emotional distress, sometimes appearing to be under the influence of something, always in crisis mode. The apartment in the background got progressively worse, clutter becoming filth, organization becoming chaos. We're talking about overflowing litter boxes, creating a smell so bad that viewers commented on it through the screen. Children's spaces that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in months. Shannon herself appearing increasingly disheveled, sometimes struggling to form coherent sentences. And the thing is, from a mental health perspective, what we're witnessing is someone in active psychological crisis, possibly experiencing severe depression, anxiety, and potentially substance use issues, trying to maintain a public persona while their private life disintegrates. But get this, here's the most heartbreaking part. The audience kept watching, not to help, not to intervene, but to be entertained by the spectacle. The comments during those live streams broke my heart. They ranged from genuine concern to outright mockery, with a disturbing number of people treating Shannon's breakdown like a reality TV show. And through it all, Shannon maintained her narrative. She was the victim. She was being persecuted. She was suffering for Christ. The worse things got, the more she doubled down on these claims, as if saying them louder would somehow make them true. But the thing is, there's a limit to how long you can perform your dysfunction for an audience before reality intervenes. And for Shannon's family, that intervention came in the form of Child Protective Services. And so this is the part of Shannon's story where the performance ended and real consequences began. So because you can manipulate an online audience, you can also gaslight your critics. You can even convince yourself that your dysfunction is actually spiritual warfare. but you cannot manipulate child welfare investigators. The details of the CPS intervention aren't fully public, and honestly, they shouldn't be. Those children deserve privacy. But what we know from court records and Shannon's own statements paints a picture that's both predictable and heartbreaking. The living conditions that viewers had been watching deteriorate on live streams weren't just unsightly, they were dangerous. We're talking about health hazards, basic sanitation failures, and children living in an environment that no child should have to endure. So what's particularly telling is Shannon's reaction to the intervention. Instead of taking responsibility, instead of recognizing this as a wake-up call, she immediately went into victim mode. The CPS workers were attacking her family. The system was persecuting Christians. The removal of her children was evidence of how righteous she was. Now, can you imagine being so committed to your own narrative, so invested in your victim identity that you'd rather blame a conspiracy than acknowledge that your children were living in conditions that endangered their health and safety? The live streams after the children were removed are some of the most disturbing content I've ever seen. Shannon, instead of focusing on what she needed to do to get her children back, spent her time ranting about persecution, asking for money to fight the system, and positioning herself as a martyr for religious freedom. Those children, they were innocent kids who never asked to have their lives broadcast to strangers. But in the end, they were removed from their own home because the adults responsible for protecting them had prioritized their online personas over basic parenting responsibilities. And do you know what the most tragic part is? Even then, even after losing her children, Shannon's first instinct was to perform her grief for an audience, to monetize her trauma, to turn her family's destruction into content. So, what happened after Shannon lost custody of her children? Did she take responsibility? Did she work towards reunification? Well, let me tell you about Shannon's idea of taking accountability. So, look, instead of addressing the underlying issues that led to the CPS intervention, Shannon doubled down on her victim narrative. She started a new platform called Revelation News. Because of course she did, where she and Jason would broadcast what they called religious programming. And by religious programming, I mean rambling, often incoherent streams where they'd mix Christianity with conspiracy theories, science fiction references, and what appeared to be drug-influenced commentary on current events. So Jason would introduce Shannon as some kind of spiritual authority, referring to her insights as prophetic revelation. Shannon would make bizarre claims about having spiritual visions, receiving messages from God, understanding hidden meanings in popular culture. Now, what we're seeing here is the complete detachment from reality that often happens when someone's delusion system becomes so elaborate that they can't function in the real world anymore. Shannon had created an identity so dependent on being special, being persecuted, being misunderstood, that she couldn't exist without that framework. And meanwhile, they're still begging for money. Even at this point, still claiming they can't work because of Shannon's health conditions, still refusing to take any actual steps towards addressing the issues that led to their children being removed. The living conditions didn't improve. If anything, they got worse. Photos and videos from this period show an apartment that looks like a health hazard, with Shannon and Jason living in what can only be described as squalor while continuing to present themselves as spiritual authorities online. So this is when I realized we weren't just looking at someone's mental health crisis or addiction issues. We were looking at a pattern of behavior so entrenched, so systematically destructive that it had become their entire identity. Now let's dig into the psychological mechanisms that allowed Shannon to destroy her family while maintaining her victim narrative. Because understanding this isn't just about a single person, it's about recognizing these patterns when we can see them in our own lives and communities. From a clinical perspective, Shannon exhibits several concerning patterns that suggest deep-seated personality issues combined with possible substance use and definite reality distortion. But what makes her case particularly complex is how she weaponized mental health and religious concepts to avoid accountability. The persecution complex isn't just a defense mechanism. It's become her primary source of identity and self-worth. Shannon literally cannot exist psychologically without being the victim of some injustice. Because being the victim means she never has to examine her own behavior or take responsibility for consequences. Now think about it. If you're always being attacked, if you're always being misunderstood, if you're always being persecuted, then every bad thing that happens to you is evidence of how special and righteous you are. It's a closed system that protects the ego from having to confront painful truths. And the thing is, Jason is the perfect enabler for this system. He gets to feel important by being Shannon's protector and interpreter. He gets to avoid his own responsibilities by focusing on Shannon's needs. Their dysfunction feeds on itself, with each person's issues reinforcing the others. Now, the most heartbreaking aspect is how the children became casualties of their parents' psychological dysfunction. Kids who needed stability got chaos. Kids who needed protection got exploitation. Kids who needed privacy got their lives broadcast to strangers. But here's what really keeps me up. Shannon's story isn't unique. The specific details might be extreme, but the underlying patterns, using trauma for attention, weaponizing identity for personal gain, performing dysfunction for an audience, these are increasingly common in our social media culture. You see, we've created a system where being a victim can become a career, where trauma becomes content, where the worst moments of someone's life can be monetized for an audience that's hungry for drama and dysfunction. So, where does Shannon's story stand today? Well, the short answer is not much has changed, and that might be the most depressing part of this entire investigation. As of the most recent information I could find, Shannon and Jason are living with Jason's uncle in Pennsylvania. They're still financially dependent on others, still making no meaningful progress towards reunification with their children, still performing their dysfunction for whatever audience they can maintain. The social media posts, when they surface on new platforms before getting banned, show the same pattern. The same victim narratives, the same requests for money, the same refusal to take accountability for the circumstances that led to their children being removed. This consistency is actually important to understand because it shows us that Shannon's behavior isn't just a response to crisis or mental health struggles, it's become her core identity. She literally doesn't know how to exist without being the victim of some injustice. The children, from what we can determine from public records, remain in foster care, and honestly, that's probably the best possible outcome for them right now. They're getting stability, safety, and hopefully therapy to help them process the trauma of growing up in such a chaotic environment. What's particularly frustrating is that Shannon has had multiple opportunities to change course. Social workers, family members, even viewers have offered concrete help, resources, and pathways to improvement, but every offer of real help gets rejected because it would require her to acknowledge that she's part of the problem. Meanwhile, the financial situation continues to deteriorate. They're reportedly facing eviction proceedings, have no stable income, and remain completely dependent on the charity of others, while refusing to take steps that might actually help improve their circumstances. So, Shannon's story raises questions that go far beyond one's family dysfunction. We need to talk about what her case reveals about our culture, our social media ecosystem, and how we consume other people's trauma as entertainment. First, let's address the elephant in the room: platform responsibility. YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, these platforms profited from Shannon's content. They collected ad revenue while someone broadcasted their children's neglect, their domestic violence, their substance use to thousands of viewers. And at this point, do these platforms even have the responsibility to intervene? I mean, when someone is clearly in crisis, when children are being endangered, when the content itself is causing harm, is free speech really the highest value we should prioritize? But we also need to examine our role as viewers. Shannon's audience wasn't just passively watching, they were actively engaging, donating money, and in many cases, encouraging the dysfunction because it was entertaining. We've created a culture where trauma becomes content, where the most vulnerable moments of someone's life become entertainment for others. Shannon's story is extreme, but it's not unique. We see variations of this pattern across social media platforms every day. There's something deeply disturbing about how personal breakdown can become a business model. Shannon learned that the more dysfunctional her content became, the more engagement and money she received. That's a perverse incentive system that rewards self-destruction. And side note, we also need to acknowledge how Shannon's story reveals vulnerabilities in religious communities. The language of faith, persecution, and suffering can be weaponized by manipulators who understand how to push those cultural buttons. Most importantly, Shannon's case highlights how inadequately we protect children in the digital age. Those kids had their trauma broadcast to strangers, their dysfunction monetized, their privacy violated, and it took years for any authority to intervene. Okay, so what can we learn from Shannon's story? What does her family's destruction teach us about ourselves, our culture, and how we can do better? First, we need to recognize the signs of manipulation, even when it's wrapped in religious language or victim narratives. Someone can be genuinely struggling while also being genuinely manipulative. These things aren't mutually exclusive. We need to develop better media literacy, especially when it comes to social media content. Just because someone is crying, just because they're asking for help, just because they claim to be persecuted, that doesn't automatically mean their narrative is accurate or that sending money is actually helpful. When we see children involved in dysfunctional online content, we need to be willing to report our concerns to appropriate authorities. Those kids can't advocate for themselves, and their parents clearly aren't prioritizing their well-being. We also need to demand better from social media platforms. They can't claim to care about user safety while simultaneously profiting from content that exploits children and enables destructive behavior. Real help looks different from enabling. Real support involves boundaries, accountability, and sometimes saying no to requests that perpetuate dysfunction. Shannon's story shows us what happens when a community mistakes enabling for compassion. We need to better understand how trauma can become identity, how victimhood can become addictive, and how the need for attention and validation can override parental instincts and basic self-preservation. Most importantly, we need to remember that behind every viral story, every online drama, every content creator meltdown, there are real people, often children, whose lives are being impacted by decisions made for an audience that will move on to the next story tomorrow. You see, Shannon's story haunts me because it's not really about one woman's breakdown. It's about how we've created a culture where breakdown becomes content, where trauma becomes currency, where the most vulnerable members of our society can be exploited for entertainment. You see, I started this investigation thinking I was analyzing one person's bad choices. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized I was looking at a mirror reflecting our collective failures as platforms, as audiences, as a society that claims to care about children and families while creating systems that incentivize their destruction. The question that makes me feel unease isn't how could Shannon do this to her children. It's how do we create a world where doing this to her children became profitable. Those kids deserve better. They deserved parents who would protect them instead of exploiting them. They deserve privacy instead of publicity. They deserve stability instead of chaos performed for strangers on the internet. And maybe if we're honest about our role in creating the demand for this kind of content, we can do better for the next family, the next children, the next person in crisis who's being told that their trauma is content and their breakdown is entertainment. Because at the end of the day, that's what this is really about. Protecting the people who can't protect themselves from a culture that would rather watch them suffer than help them heal. Anyway, stay cozy, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.
We're at 6:54, guys. We can bring it up more. We can bring it up more, guys. 6:57. We can bring it up. Let's get it up to 1,000. I need to pay for my kids. I need to take care of my kids. Absurdity may need to go. Oh, that's fine. That's fine.